up. Like, my belly is just, oh my God. Okay. Hello, everyone. How does it go? Very good. Ready? You ready? Very good, very good. Yay! I had to. Thank you. Okay. So, today we're going to be speaking about something called epistemic violence. Has anybody heard this term before? Of course you have, Prof. Anyone else that isn't an academic? No? All right. So, stories, violence, and the future of drug policy research. Am I clicking the right button? I should let you all know that I'm autistic, so sometimes like things will just happen randomly and it's not my fault. Like this. Is it this way?
Yeah.
Yay! Okay, awesome. Okay, so I'm Mackayla Forde. I'm a PhD London Interdisciplinary Social Sciences Training Doctoral Partnership. I'm sure I've got two of those letters the wrong way around. You can see. I'm interested in decolonial research methods, Black women's health and stories as technologies of freedom. And I'm an autistic woman of dual heritage who happens to love Emmerdale. And Corrie, actually. Corrie, oh my God. Never mind. Okay. So the story so far, we're going to be talking about the story so far in terms of what's happening with drugs and cannabis and so on and so forth. You'll see as we move forward. We're going to speak about epistemic violence. I'm going to touch on my research and why it's relevant, and then we're going to reflect. But before we get into this presentation, what I'd really like to do is just hold a moment to acknowledge everybody that's passed away because of punitive drug law. Everybody that's working to, sort this punitive way of dealing with people out. Like, it's really important in my tradition to acknowledge who we call ancestors, those that have done the work so that we can be here today, continuing this really important work. Okay, so for those of you that have lost anybody to drugs, or not even to drugs, to the government, I just wanted to acknowledge that. Okay, so the story so far, I want to start by making sure we're all on the same page. So our point of departure will be an acknowledgement of the facts. Policy is rooted in the creation and perpetuation of racist stories, stereotypes about Black people to justify what we call the Ma'afa. So in Swahili, the Ma'afa means the great devastation, and that's in reference to 400 years of human trafficking, enslavement, and colonialism. These stories about who we are and who we were repeated in literature and in places of power to legitimize a trade and subsequent hierarchy based on race. And I should also talk about the fact that we were, as Black people during that time, not allowed to read or write unless we were reading parts of the King James Bible. Right? So we weren't allowed to tell our own stories. We weren't allowed to communicate our identities. Our names were stripped back from us. Our languages, our ways of knowing, our epistem, meaning ways of knowing, were stripped back. So an identity was placed upon us. Okay, so for people of African descent, stories are important ways of documenting our history and our culture, passing on moral values. We have used stories in the past to talk about escaping slave masters. People in my culture would plait maps into our hair and also put rice grains in our hair to survive. And stories were told through the patterns of hair. We weren't allowed to, beat drums because we could also communicate via music and via drums. In criminalizing reading and writing, the West blocked us from self-identification and telling our own stories. This is called epistemic violence. Okay. So I decided to write my own version of what I think and feel epistemic violence is. And I'd like to describe it to mean a form of violence which is enacted through the delegitimizing of some, usually non-white origin, knowledge and ways of knowing, and the acceptance of and proliferation of hegemonic, meaning the dominant discourse, usually white ways and forms of knowledge. And as you can see, we have various understandings of what epistemic violence is, but ultimately it's a form of domination through erasure of knowledge, okay? So epistemic violence allowed for these stories to be perpetuated about us. And ultimately it's led to the stereotypes you see of young black men and women, which has led to disproportionate stopping and searching of people like myself. It's led to heavier and longer prison sentences for people that look like us, and particularly heavier and longer sentences for drug use, sale, and production. And by omitting our stories, the West has allowed the perpetuation of these negative stereotypes and stories. So a little bit about my story. Does anyone recognize that person there? You may have seen her. Her name's Dr. Jennifer Randall, and I stalked her. I didn't literally stalk her, but she taught my professional development module when I was doing my undergraduate degree, and then she left the University of East London and went to Queen Mary University. So I was like, well, I'm going with you, mate. So I followed her there, got her to write my letter. You know, all of the kind of loopholes, I used all of them, got into Queen Mary University. So I think I've gone a bit too far with my notes. So prior to 2015, I had no idea about the connections between drug policy and the Ma'afa, the trade in enslaved Africans, and epistemic violence. Jen, who is now one of my brilliant PhD supervisors, had us dissect a book called High Price. Has anybody heard of Professor Carl Hart? Yeah, I'm seeing some nods. Okay, so she had us read, reread, and dissect this book, right? So we read this, we trained with Stopwatch, big up Stopwatchers in the house, and then we read and reread Release's reports on drug and substance policy. As a cannabis ambassador, working class black woman and budding academic, I was moved to investigate the direction of the growing cannabis market. My research was titled, An Intersectional Critique of Historical and Contemporary Cannabis Regulation in the USA, Necropolitics, Race and Social Justice. And for those of you that do not know what necropolitics is, because I didn't know what it meant until about 3 years ago, it's the theory of who gets to decide who gets to live and who gets to die. Yeah? And it was created by a man called Achille Mbembe. Anyone that wants any of that information after the talk, you're more than welcome to approach me to speak about it. Okay. So my research basically connects race with death. Gone back, here we go. So at the time of my master's in 2008, it looked like really good progress was being made in the cannabis markets. We had England producing and exporting, and was the largest producer and exporter of medicinal cannabis for research purposes. The cannabis industry was set to quadruple in 3 years from $7 billion to $34 billion. And there was limited access available, as we heard from Hannah earlier on, for specific needs on the NHS, cancer, epilepsy. We've got to question that now. But that was available. However, black people was and are still being disproportionately stopped, searched, charged and convicted and incarcerated, and less than 5% of cannabis businesses in the USA were owned by black people. Why? Because if you had a felon, if you were convicted of using cannabis or had any kind of felony on your file whatsoever, you were not allowed to run a cannabis business at that time. And considering obviously black men and women disproportionately impacted by this legislation, you would think that provision would be made for those populations. And I think there has been somewhat work done on that since I created this. But what this indicated to me was that the presence of ongoing racism was still there, and victims of punitive policy were locked out of participating in the growing cannabis market and were still being over-policed for a substance that had low self-reported use amongst black people. Okay, does anyone recognize any of these faces? Okay, so when I dug deeper, I discovered the glorious Harry Anslinger. He's a wanker. He basically initiated a war on a massive war on drugs in the States. He was about to lose his post at the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, and so to bolster his relevance, he decided he would launch an attack on cannabis users who tended to be poor, black or white people. He went after a woman called Billie Holiday, Lady Day. I'm sure some of you know about that. For those that do not, he went after her because she was a heroin user. Judy Garland was also a heroin user, but he supported her through her use of heroin. Unfortunately, we lost Lady Day at 44 years old, and she died from heroin withdrawals because Anslinger told the guards guarding her hospital bed that she was not to be given any kind of morphine or any kind of replacement whatsoever. You can see Reagan and the lovely Maggie Thatcher responsible for the 1984 Just Say No campaign, also responsible for the expansion of prisons due to the influx of black people filling them. Right now, the US holds a third of its prison population tend to be black people. Okay. Okay, so what I did. So once I was familiar with all of those demons that we saw before, and the policies and the laws that created this hostile environment, I decided I would look through the documents of the big players in drug policy and see if race and this epistemic violence and the foundations of drug law were mentioned in these papers. So I basically looked at at these keywords here. So we have race, racism, racist, racial, injustice, discrimination, and inequalities, and I did a qualitative content analysis, so we're looking through documents and words of 41 policy papers from 7 NGOs. There's a reason I haven't mentioned them, and I'll come back to that. I did the keyword search of 2,667 pages of reports, right? And I've just got to mention, you'd think that that would take me forever, wouldn't you? Yeah, it really didn't, and there's a reason, I'll show you. Thematic analysis of content, I was looking at a thematic analysis, so that's basically looking at where the words are positioned in the text and where they show up. So I did that with these words. 4 broad themes were identified. We had policing in the criminal justice system, we had national and international drug legislation, healthcare and substance use and cannabis policy, and 41 documents searched for the keywords, right? Discrimination was found 184 times. Remember, 2,667 pages, okay? Discrimination was found 184 times. The word racial was found 74 times. Race was found 50 times. Inequality was found 27 times. Injustice found 9 times. Racism found 3 times. And racist was found twice. It's worth noting that the word racism appeared a total of 3 times, and not once was it in any body of text. It set down the axis of a graph, or in the contents, or in the references. It wasn't even considered. Okay, and I've gone past all my notes because I knew that bit off by heart. Okay. So the essentially the omission of the word racism and those words that you would expect to find in these documents shows that this epistemic violence, this story, is still being told. We're still being the people that are suffering from this punitive way of dealing with us, and this very racist way, actually, of dealing with us is not being addressed. So my research essentially demonstrated that victims of punitive cannabis policy and epistemic violence are still being silenced. This is a continuation of symbolic and systemic epistemic violence used to justify enslavement, and epistemic violence is at the root of all punitive drug policy. This violence is being enacted on the global majority being that the majority of people on the planet are black and brown. So reflection, Malcolm X, progress is healing the wound. I later on found out that that quote goes on for a lot longer. And actually the quote goes on to say that you can stab a knife in my back and pull it out 3 inches, but just by pulling it out 3 inches, you haven't addressed the problem, right? And that's what that pertains to. Okay. Bear with me. So essentially, epistemic injustice will continue for as long as stories are considered less than, as evidenced by researchers' hierarchy of evidence, which places quantitative, it places stats, numbers right at the top of what's considered evidence, and stories and experiences, lived experience, right at the bottom. Policymakers will replicate harms enacted by cannabis policy if it continues to dismiss our stories, the victim stories. Incorporating and infusing policy papers with our stories, our truths, and the history of policy could validate qualitative research methods, stories, and add legitimacy, which would challenge hegemonic practice. So if we really wish to reduce harm in drug policy formation, we must prioritize the rethinking of our approaches and our understandings of what best practice looks like, and what best practice is and for who. I mean, who is this best practice for, right? As well as our own orientation when forming drug policy. Chimamanda Adichie talks about the danger of a single story. I would strongly suggest you look up the danger of a single story on YouTube when you get home. And what she does a TED talk, and what she did in this TED talk was talk about how there's one story that has weaved its way through history, right? But all of these other stories are around that no one ever hears. If we continue with this idea of one story around research being quantitative and only numbers mattering, around drug policy only being suited to some people and not to others, only impacting and being helpful to some, not to others, etc., then we'll continue to perpetuate the harms that have been enacted by this single story, which says that people that use and sell and take drugs are bad people. Also, you know, and the point of my presentation being that those who do not benefit from cannabis laws, those who do not benefit from the legislation that allows people to get substances they need, like these are the things that will continue for as long as we don't recognize that actually substances do help people, and that those that take them aren't all black, we're not all criminals, right? So hopefully we can write a new chapter, and it's a healing chapter. I'm going to, that is the end of my presentation, okay? But I'm going to finish with a piece, being the poet that I am, and also wanting to honor you and everybody that's come here. And as somebody that does use cannabis regularly, because I suffer with ADHD and crippling anxiety, I'm going to share a piece, and it's called Little Green Friend. And in the most unprofessional way, I'm going to read it from my phone, because I left my book at home. I actually have a book, I left it at home. So I'm going to read it for you. And I'm sure there are those in the room that can relate. Okay. It suppressed my aggression, my anger and depression, making a cruel world disappear into puffs of sweet green smoke. Painful childhood memories of the desperate need for a mother's love or an absent father's hugs, and not being fully able to comprehend who and what I was, were expelled with every exhalation and temporarily smudged out of my mind. Bags of illegal escapism were supplied by 100 different dealers. Though I never bought the weed they sold, I purchased a fleeting freedom, a moment of sometimes creative peace or hours of meaningless laughter, followed by a heavy, dreamless sleep. I cherished this substance that helped me forget those things that tormented me, smoking it to free my mind of stress, to halt the raging waves behind my eyes, to permit myself a moment of careless, wanton selflessness, where I could abandon the body that anchored me to this painful existence and exchange it for an emotionless daydream. I blended into the beige of my smoker's corner, unable to comprehend the depth of the feelings I was swimming in, drowning in an ocean of unaddressed trauma, my smokescreen providing me with the shelter I'd looked for my whole life. But it was always temporary. The highs plunged into new lows. Every other night I'd walk to the closest payphone the moment my benefit check dropped, usually at around 1 in the morning. And with every ring of the line, I'd grow impatient until he answered, and then I'd stay up for as long as it took, a wired insomniac waiting for the doorbell to ring, becoming less fussed about whether the dealer would bring buds or dust as long as he bought me something. It wouldn't matter that I hadn't eaten in a week, because nothing makes me feel weaker than having to feel everything. I just wanted to breathe without crying, to be without trying. And smoking weed enabled a mindset that told me that it was okay not to care, allowing me to just sit there. Believe me when I say that it's a space that's hard to leave, and it calls you back whenever survival feels too heavy a burden. I mean, all you have to do is roll up, light up, kick back, and be swept away into a purple haze where you can float on clouds of smoke for days until you're washed up onto reality's stony beaches, hungry, alone and depleted, wanting once more to go offshore. It's the most toxic of relationships, and yet to it I always return, to the familiar burn of burning herbs and Rizzler papers, that comforting sting on the back of the throat, and then the calm before the storm every addict's nose approaches. And I take it right down to the roach, every time, hoping this time will be my last. But my past won't leave me alone, and this hostile world has never felt like home. So for as long as I have to wear a mask, this beautiful visual lie that convinces everybody that I'm doing fine, I'll stay lit, craving freedom, bent on lightness, devoted to ignorance and to bliss, hooked on creative expression and color and deep sleep. Until poverty and injustice no longer dictate the terms of my life, and this life grants me permission to live, I'll use, because it provides me with the comfort that a life of want cannot give. And I enjoy feeling its calm settle my shattered nerves and dreams, which I imagine and then channel through my poetry. I feel its effects flow through me. I feel the anger go quickly. The prickly bitterness of my disappointment in society becomes a distant memory. And in that space there is clarity. In that moment, I am fully me. Prison is worth the risk if I get to experience happiness for a little bit. To witness my inner scenery change from the sooty grey of a British winter, transformed into the candy floss pink of a cherry tree. And if I had been given half the opportunities my peers had in their adolescence, my adulthood wouldn't look like a deadly dance between lung cancer and encroaching criminality. Weed wouldn't be the gateway of my sanity, and I wouldn't be locked into this relentless cycle of dependency on a little green friend I met on the stairs of my estate at 14, who has stood by me through my losses and wins, clean into my 30s. And maybe I'll get clean, I hate that saying, get clean, in my 40s. But I like this so-called dirty habit. So there you have it, my truth. The reasons behind my problematic use, and if I gave it up, I'd give up and I wouldn't be here talking to you. I'll probably return to purchase that fleeting freedom, because nothing makes me feel weaker than feeling everything. This substance shields my soul from life's torments, and this poem is my proof. Thank you.